I'm Stephanie Wilson, and you're listening to Freedom Over Fascism. Hi, friends. Welcome back to the podcast. It's been quite an eventful couple weeks, and I hope you're taking it at a pace you can manage. I've done my share of catastrophizing, but I also took action. I went to the Lexington, Massachusetts hands-off protest. You can find an interview I did with the organizer and some pictures at www.freedomoverfascism.us. Where did you go? I was so inspired by both the number of protests and the number of people nationwide and even around the world. And I hope we can all turn out for the next one in a couple of weeks. And what about that Cory Booker? He got the assignment. He won't be able to make a huge change with his feat of extraordinary endurance, but he can sure bring attention to the need for opposition to the regime. In Judaism, we have a compilation of ethical teachings. And one of the things we learn is, quote, "Do not be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief. Do justly now. Love mercy now. Walk humbly now. You are not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to abandon it." End quote. Today I talked with Antonia Scatton, author of the Substack Reframing America, who talks with me about how people understand and remember language. She studies the cognition of language, meaning how we say things and the order we say them really matter. She worked with George Lakoff for a long while, so her work is informed by his teaching. She talks to us about how we inadvertently repeat the regime's message when we think we're arguing against it. And we discuss what it might take to share our values and positions with our fellow Americans. Also, I want to remind you that we do not need to use the regime's name for anything. So we should be referring to Trump tariffs, MAGA murder budget, and the Slave Act. Let's get creative and keep repeating strong messages that characterize the regime. You can find me, as always, on the Substack at www.freedomoverfascism.us. If you have the means, I ask you to sign up for a paid subscription. But in any case, please subscribe so you can see my writing as well. Thanks for listening. Now here's my conversation with Antonia. Antonia Scatton, welcome to Freedom Over Fascism.
Thank you for having me. It's nice to be here.
We talked a couple weeks ago, not recording, and you wrote in your Substack, Reframing America, a couple weeks ago about how people understand language from a cognitive point of view and how we're doing ourselves no favors by the way we talk about what's going on in the United States right now. And we can get to what's going on in the United States right now. But I would love to go back and just flesh that out a little bit. So our audience has some familiarity with messaging. I've talked about it a lot. I've had people on talking about it. But I think going straight to what cognitive processes are involved in people understanding and retaining information.
So I think one of the themes that I talk about a lot in my newsletter is this idea of exposure to language. The idea that most folks out there who are not, especially those who do not follow the news closely, are receiving language not in full sentences, sometimes just in jumbles of words. Like I imagine somebody sitting in a bar and the news is playing on the screen behind the bar, but the sound is off and they're just seeing what's scrolling by on the Chiron. And then one guy turns to the next guy and he says, "Oh, what's that about?" It's, "Oh, something having to do with Trump and efficiency."
Mm-hmm.
It's this idea that people get exposed to words together and they don't know whether the argument is for something or against it. They just hear those things together and that has an impact. In neurologically speaking, everything we know is in our brain in a neural network somewhere. And when we hear a word, it lights up that part of our brain. And so if two parts of our brain get lit up together, they get connected. Like they literally sort of grow more connected. So when we talk about things, part of the way fascists or dictators or whatever, how they get us to help them build strength and power is by tricking us into creating associations that we don't want to create. And we feel like, oh my God, we have to stand up for people. We have to respond. We can't tolerate this. And so we end up using all of our time and energy making the case against something in a way that just reinforces it. Like saying transgender people are not predators. If you say that, you just associate transgender people with being predators. Anytime you're saying not, or we're using quotes for something, you know that that's language you don't want to be using. So it's a very big tactic that they use, and it's been very effective for them.
They develop phrases which they repeat over and over and over. And then when we finally get our act together, those phrases are already there and we end up refuting them, using them, like waste, fraud, and abuse, right? All they talk about is waste, fraud, and abuse. So then when we are talking about how, the government is not mostly, Social Security is mostly not waste, fraud, and abuse, we've just made their argument for them. So, how do we flip the script so we're not playing into their hands and so that we're showing a vision of what we would think would be better?
So I think, I mean, in that case, mm, yeah, you have to look at the content that you're about to share, everything, and say, what are the words that pop out of this? What are the key words? Do we want people thinking of those words together? So obviously with social security and Ponzi scheme. Like
Right.
I can't tell you how many times I saw people saying, "Oh my God, Elon Musk said that social security was a Ponzi scheme." And I'm like, don't connect those things.
Right.
So instead of saying social security is not a Ponzi scheme, say cryptocurrency is a Ponzi scheme because it is. It actually is a Ponzi scheme. It's imaginary money. And instead of saying there's no waste, fraud, and abuse in social security, one of the things I found most interesting that I heard lately is that the staffing of the federal government hasn't increased in 50 years,
Right.
that it's actually shockingly efficient. If you look at Social Security, Medicare, the IRS, these are lean operations. You want to talk about these civil servants, they're working for us, they're lean, they're efficient, they haven't had staffing increases in 50 years, even though the population has grown. And so you want to associate Social Security with retirement security, with an obligation we have to each other, with agreement, with commitment, with promise, with the fact that we earned it, that it's our money.
Right. It was
But whatever you do,
literally taken out of our paychecks.
yeah. So whatever you do, don't repeat what they're saying about it because there's almost no way to try to argue. Like anytime you're arguing against what they're saying about it, the topic of conversation is whatever they're saying about it.
Right. And
And
so you've
so
lost
to
from the
to
beginning.
change the agenda is to talk about what it is about that thing that we want people talking about. And then that's what people get exposed to, and that's what they think about, and that's what starts to grow stronger.
So if we were to talk about this, we're not going to put the words together that they put together. Can you help us with ways what you just did with Social Security, ways to frame something that really talks about our values? One of the things that I've been talking a lot about is politics is an expression of our values. So how do we talk about, I guess, just how would you change the messaging structure of the, let's say, anti-MAGA coalition, Dems, however you want to say that, in a way that would be far more effective, assuming for the moment that we could actually break through their noise?
I mean, one of the most important things I think we need to talk about, especially right now, are just what is government for? What is government and what is it for? We can't shy away from using the term government. And we have to talk about it in terms of, since I spent a lot of time thinking about this and thinking, what does this really mean? And it's, if government is us, it is how we cooperate. It is at its most basic element, it is simply a tool that we as a society use to do things, to cooperate, to take care of each other, to protect each other. It's how we get freedom. If we didn't have government, the big and the powerful would just be able to stomp all over everybody. So one of the things I realized, I was like, what is it about Medicaid? What is it about the Health and Human Services? All of these programs. And one thing they all have in common is that the reason they get passed in the budget year after year after year is because everybody agrees that we want these things. Like for generations, Republicans and Democrats alike have voted in Congress to fund Health and Human Services, to fund things like the Center for Disease Control, to fund the post office. There's a consensus around these things, and it's because we want to use government to track and protect us from infectious diseases. We agree on that. And what we're seeing right now is somebody who comes along and wants to destroy that. And this is, I mean, this is what the federal government is. It's the work of generations of Americans on both sides of the aisle deciding that they want to do these things to take care of each other. And if you look at them one by one, most people in America would say, yeah, that's a good thing to be doing. Yes, we decided to pay farmers to produce food for schools. Win-win. Great idea. We need for our small farmers to stay in business. This is part of how we help them do that. We need our kids to eat. This is a win-win for everybody. So the tricky part comes in trying to understand what their motives are. Like, why are they doing this? Because there doesn't seem to be any logical reason for it other than sabotaging it so they can turn it all over to the private sector.
Right. And I think a lot of people don't even know a fraction of what, like this farm program to school, it just happens. And most of us don't know that it's
There's
happening.
hundreds of different things, different programs. And that's part of what makes it really difficult is how do you, especially to people who aren't paying very close attention, how do you get it across to them? And I think the way we do it is by coming up with sort of broader categories that these things fall under. So we talk about protecting each other, like we live in this country together. We care what happens to each other. We are responsible for each other, and we're also responsible for our part in making this government work for everybody. So when we support a program, they're like the idea of protecting each other, even if you think of it in terms of, say, physical protection. So we protect each other from crime, from buildings that collapse, from airplane crashes, from road crashes, from disease, from contaminated food. These are just all examples of ways that we protect each other, that we use government to protect each other so that we don't have to deal with these things individually. So when something happens, we can say, this is just one more example of a way in which we protect each other that they're trying to get rid of. And even things like this farm program, I mean, you can just say, look, one of the things that we do with government is keep our economy strong, is to support people who are trying to who keep their businesses afloat. And we know that we depend on farmers to produce food, and we do things to make sure that these guys can stay in business because we believe that's important. That's part of how we take care of each other. And so
That's our
just like we have loans for small business, you lump them all together into, this is just one of the many ways in which we support small businesses because we think they're valuable. They're important to have in our economy, and they provide a lot of really high quality jobs. So you lump it together into these sort of larger categories. I think it makes, because people won't necessarily remember the individual items, but they'll
right.
remember the kind of general idea that, like, oh, we're using government to protect each other.
Right. I mean, even as I think about it, the framers of the Constitution, is this the first thing they say. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice. Okay, that means that everybody has the same laws. Ensure domestic tranquility. So we're not like fighting each other or committing crimes against each other. Provide for the common defense.
Hmm.
So we stay safe from aggressors. Promote the general welfare, which is everything that you're talking about, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. That
Yeah.
is everything that we're trying to message. And we talk about the Constitution for a really long time. I used to believe that the Constitution was our national religion. Essentially, we had religion, but our national creed was around this Constitution, this piece of paper that all of the states have signed on to, and yet they are claiming the Constitution for themselves. So, what I want to ask you is how have we gone from the preamble talking about every single thing that we believe in to them sucking all the meaning out of words and leaving us with words that either they've defined or that have lost all meaning entirely?
I mean, starting, gosh, in like what, 1964, they've been on a very concerted campaign to change the meaning of words. And for example, like the first time I heard freedom of religion being used to justify discrimination against gay people, I was like, that's just batch. Like, how could you do that? That is the most crazy thing I've ever heard. Now it's constitutional law. But that was the Supreme Court backs that one up. And part of it is because they went out there and it's a framing issue. They reframed it. They basically said that discriminating against gay people is our constitutional right to practice our religion. But that's part of I think there is a bigger picture framing that covers actually a lot of different issues, and that's the idea that freedom, like they've a lot of this comes down to their concept of freedom. And I think we've all heard that thing that your right, your freedom to throw a punch ends where my nose begins. But it's really actually more of a societal thing. And it's you're free to do whatever you want as long as you don't hurt anybody else. But there comes a point when your behavior is bad for society as a whole, is bad for the community, it's bad for other people. And what they're saying is, I should have the right, I should be free to do things even if they harm other people. I think we should change that from freedom to license because they're essentially saying, I want to dump pollution into this drinking water. I would like the state to give me exemption, to give me a license to do that, to give me permission to do that, so I can be exempted from being held responsible for how my behavior impacts others. And it's the same with this financial freedom. This I own private property. I should be able to do whatever I want with it. I should be able to make money regardless of how it impacts other people, which is their market freedom that they're always talking about. But really what they're saying is, I want the government to give me a free pass to exploit people and and when everybody gets mad about this and tries to throw me out of the tribe, I want government to protect me so that I may exploit people and then be protected from the consequences of those actions. So that is how they change the meaning of freedom. And the thing is, a lot of what happens is that when they try to change the meaning of words, we just kind of roll our eyes and go, that's ridiculous. We don't take seriously that taking freedom of religion and applying it the way they did and claiming that opposition to abortion, that discriminating against gay people is protected religious behavior. It sounded so crazy to us that we did not realize that we needed to fight back against that. Like the response to that, instead of saying discriminating against gay people is not religious freedom, which just associated those things, we should have come out and talked about what religious freedom is.
Mhm.
We should have come out and just said, this country was really founded on the right of people to be free to practice their conscience. This is a pluralistic society. You wouldn't want, like, I had the most interesting conversation with a family. I like to when I travel a lot, I stay at Airbnbs with hosts. It's like a little focus group of people across America, and I stayed with this family, and they were very conservative. So I said, "Okay, so your opposition to abortion is your religious belief?" And they said, "Yeah." And I said, "Do you live in a society in which we have a number of different religions?" "Yes." And they said, "Yeah." And they said, "You wouldn't want you would not want to be forced to live by somebody else's religion." And they said, "No, no, of course not." And I said, "Did you ever think of it this way? That laws that protect choice allow everybody to practice their religion. But if you try to outlaw abortion, what you're saying is that other people have to live by your religion." And they were like, "Wow, I never really thought about it that way." That really is the freedom of religion position, because they
Mhm.
understood that they live in a pluralistic society and they didn't want other people forcing them to live by their rules. We have a tendency to talk about what's wrong with what conservatives are doing when we should be making the case for what's right, for what we
Mhm.
believe in. And so we end up with people not knowing what we stand for, not knowing what we would do or by what principles we would govern if we were in power. So they don't put us in power because they don't really have any idea where we stand, even when they agree with us on issues. They don't know that that's where we stand on issues because we didn't talk about them. We just kind of assume people already know.
Right. I mean, even when you're talking about freedom of religion, those people, I don't know whether you had to have a conversation about the United States as a Christian nation, but that's what a lot of people believe. They completely believe that this is how we were founded and that all of the documents that we know about, which say the opposite, they have been taught something completely different. So
We're
I
not going to
think that
reach everybody.
no, we're not going to reach everybody. We don't have to, we don't need to reach the MAGAs for electoral purposes. Eventually,
Right.
we have to live. We have to live with people, right?
Let me just say, like, using that example, rather than arguing with those people, rather than saying we were not founded as a Christian nation, we say Thomas Jefferson was a humanist. So and so we should talk about what was, not argue against what they're saying. If we actually want those people to think, instead of just saying you're wrong, the United States was not founded as a Christian nation, we say, hey, actually, Thomas Jefferson believed this, George Washington believed this. And there are places in our Constitution, in their writings, where they talk about very specifically wanting to create a country in which people were free to practice their own religion. But it's like talking about what we believe in the affirmative rather than trying to argue against what they're saying, I think is the thing we're trying to get across here. Because then we can inspire people without, like, when you say you're wrong and when you say this was not that, you trigger backlash. People get defensive, they defend their position. When you just say this is what I'm for, you make it a lot easier for people to say, I'm for that too. Like when I talked
Right.
to this family, I said, I'm for everybody getting to practice their own religion. And they were like, yeah, I'm for that too.
So there's a couple ways I want to go with this. The first is, how do we stop triggering them in an honest, values based way? And the other, I'll leave for later, but I just want to put a pin in it, is the re education that they're trying to achieve, the changing of history, the whitewashing of history. But let's not talk about that yet. Let's talk about how we talk about what we're for without triggering them.
Well, we're in such a difficult moment because generally speaking, My advice is almost always going to be to talk about what we're for, but we're in a position where we really have no choice but to stand up to what they're doing and to talk about how what Trump is doing is wrong. But I think one thing we have to remember, first of all, is that it's not the MAGA people that we need to worry about, because our temptation is we have to convince them that they're wrong.
Mhm.
Trying to do that only makes them double down in their position. The actively MAGA people, like actively liberal activists, are the diehards. These are not undecided voters. These are people who are firmly in a camp, and they're not moving from that camp. There is a huge body of people that are not paying attention, have no idea what's going on. They're not upset about the violation of the separation of powers because they don't know anything about the separation of powers. They're out there, like, sitting on those bar stools, not paying attention and just seeing stuff in passing. And we have to figure out how to reach those people. And the way we do that is through a combination of, part of it is that we just have to explain in very simple terms what's going on. We have to figure out how to talk to people who aren't paying attention. And a lot of the
Exactly.
times that requires starting the conversation with just a basic piece of information. Are you aware that the Department of Education is being closed? And that is going to affect people who have kids with disabilities, who have individualized education programs. Were you aware of that? Do you know anybody who has an EIP for their kid? That funding is likely to disappear. Did you know that? So right now, a lot of, I think, what we need to do is play the role of neutral informer and just let people know what's happening in very simple terms. It's like we skipped that step and went ahead to being outraged about it when most of the people we need to reach don't even know that it's happening, because it's not being covered in the news, or they're not watching the news. Because quite
Right.
frankly, their hands are full with their kid with disabilities. We have to let people know what's happening, I think, is just step one.
Right. Which is getting to a place in this conversation where I spend a lot of time is how do you reach people who don't talk about politics? How do you talk about politics without talking about politics? And that's kind of my central quest right now. So I was going to stay away from it, but actually I want to put the question to you. How would you talk about politics is my hobby. It's I spend a lot of time trying to figure out what's going on. And then I sit at the kitchen table with a teenager who's I don't want to hear about politics. I really don't. I mean, he's got very strong values, but he doesn't want to talk about the very little details. So how do we talk about it without talking about it?
First of all, I do think that we need to rebrand the Democratic Party, but I think that we can't do it right at this minute. I think that we start with becoming trusted messengers of what's actually happening, like just being the news that people need and keeping it simple, trying to talk about things in ways that affect people's lives. And then we bring it back to the role of government. I think now is the time that we talk about what government is for. And we don't have to talk about the politics. Like, I think we need to have a national conversation about what is actually like, but the message they're getting is that government is inherently bad, and therefore just wholesale destroying it is a good thing to do. And the fact is, we haven't made the counter case. So I've been thinking about this a lot because I'm working with a lot of local activist groups, and they're like, what do we do? I think that we may be at a point where we actually need to just go door to door and have conversations with neighbors and just say, look, we want to hear from you. What do you want from government? What do you think government should be doing? And then give them a menu of items and say, do you think it's appropriate for us to use government to test food and make sure that it doesn't have contaminants. And they're most
Right.
likely to say, yeah, I do think
Right.
that's a good use of it. But to get people thinking about why we have a federal government, because if we only focus on, oh my God, they're cutting a quarter of the workforce at Health and Human Services, the story that they've told, which is that government is inherently bad and it's wasteful and bloated and that it's been stuck and nobody's done anything about it for decades, justifies their taking extra legal measures to fix it. And so what people are thinking is finally somebody's willing to do what it takes.
Right.
And they see that as leadership. So instead, we have to come out and say, this is why we have government. This is what it's for. And if you're having a conversation with somebody, just say, what do you want from government? What would you like government to do? And then kind of expand from there. I think you're going to find that there's actually a great amount of agreement in that. And then you say, I also think we should use government for this. Did you know that that's under threat right now? And then as time goes on, then we talk about who is it that's actually for this? Who actually believes in supporting this kind of government? Because if we try to say Democrats are good, and Democrats are the party of government, they're the party of government being responsive to people, accountable to people, using government to do good things. And so if we don't fix how people think about government, we're not going to fix how people think about Democrats. So we do the government part first.
Okay.
And as it is currently under attack, this is a great time to be talking about it. I was getting a haircut, and somebody in the hair salon was talking about their IEP program for their disabled kid. And so you talk about it in terms of what it's really doing for our lives. I had to return a bunch of cans of tuna because they might have botulism in them. This stuff
Right.
actually does affect our lives every day. So if we talk about it in that way, but we actually have to use the term government. Like we can't just talk about a program.
I mean, we're so like
Yeah.
detail oriented that like we get caught up in making sure all details are accurate, and that works against us.
So caveats. Yes.
It's
We
caveats.
talk like we're applying for a grant from an academic journal where we take all the emotion and we can't make any generalizations without including all the caveats to explain like what's actually going on. It's like we have to make big, bold statements.
Right.
The post office
So
is good because it serves people that the private sector would not serve. The private sector would not go all the way out to your little town out in
right.
Southwest Virginia. That's what the post office is for. And that's
Exactly.
government. And I think connecting that dot back to that's what government is the thing we haven't done. We're not in campaign season except for 2 or 3 races here and there. We don't have to talk about the so-called political aspects of it right now. We have to talk about why it
Exactly.
matters and what they're doing.
So, given the fact that the other side has been working since 1980 to convince people that government, in fact, is the worst thing, how do we catch up to that?
I don't think we have to make up for everything that happened since back then. Because part of it, you have to keep in mind, it takes a lot more work to convince people that black is white than to convince people that white is white. What
Okay.
we're telling people is actually backed up by reality. And what they're telling people is don't believe what you're seeing with your own eyes. Also, I had this conversation recently with somebody in the Democratic muckety muck world. He said, oh, we can't talk about government. It doesn't pull well. And I was like, think of it this way. Our strategy, and they were like, oh, it's long term, yes, but for now we should avoid it. And I was like, what is it? Why do we need to start now? And I just thought what they're saying is we have allowed conservatives 100% of the control over the meaning of that word for 50 years. So what you're recommending is that we continue to give them 100% of the control over the meaning of that word, which is obviously a bad idea. But the thing is, we need to rewrite the connections in people's brains between government and the good things that we know it to mean. And the sooner we do it, and the more repeatedly we do it, and the more emphatically we do it, the sooner we will catch up. And I think also those connections fade. If people stop hearing about it, I think that if today they make half the connect associations and we make half the associations, we're already starting to catch up. If tomorrow we make twice as many, then we could be pulling ahead. And I think also, I mean, like I said, like I just sort of said, it's like we're telling people things that resonate with their real world experience, that are true, that mostly people already believe. They just don't realize they believe it. So part of what we have to do is just get them to see it from a point of view they're not used to seeing it from. And I think that will do it, because if you look at there's a bunch of Pew surveys where they ask people, do you feel that the federal government is doing enough of this or should be doing more of this or the right amount? And you look at things like making sure everybody has health care. Both parties, and in fact, on every single issue, but I think one, both Democrats and Republicans were over the 50% mark on the federal government should be playing a bigger role on this. Eliminating poverty, keeping prices down. It was about 20 different items. And so people already support government. They just don't realize that it is government that they support. So they already have those connections there. Those positive feelings are already there. We just have to connect the dots for them. And the sooner we do it, and like people believe what you say when you're consistent, you say the same thing over and over again, when you say it with conviction, and when you do not back down when somebody pushes back. And so that's what we have to do. We have to say, this is what government is for. We have to say this. We have to continue to say that. We have to mean it. We can't say it apologetically. And when they push back, we have to stand our ground. And that's how we'll do it.
So that's step one. And you said that you feel that we need to rebrand the Democratic Party. What would that brand look like if it were branded the way it should be? Not how are we going to make it stick, but what is the brand that we should be trying to achieve?
I think at this point, the biggest issue is that runaway concentration of wealth has made our economy unmanageable for most people. And now that same accumulation of wealth is taking over our government. Where a lot of people are frustrated is that they believe that Democrats are no different. And part of the reason they believe that is because we don't have a history of standing up to the corporate world in the way that we should. And in fact, what they call the China shock, when thousands of factories closed and towns were destroyed, that happened under Bill Clinton's watch. When the economy crashed in 2008 and then Obama came in and fixed a lot of it. Also, it took a long time for us to recover from that. And a lot of people were like, okay, the bankers crashed the economy. Why aren't they in jail? So there's a certain sense that we have not stood up to protect them. So we can say, if we say that, we have to say it in a way that they understand that we mean it. And I think what happened during Biden is that Biden actually did a lot of these things. He really stood up to corporations. He started reinforcing antitrust laws in a way that hadn't happened in a long time. But his political advisors were like, we don't really want to talk about this. So
I
we
mean,
have
there
to,
were some
yeah,
basic things. Had they called it, instead of the bipartisan infrastructure bill, if they had called it the Biden infrastructure bill, that would have gone
yeah,
a
that
ways.
would have helped.
And calling it the Inflation Reduction Act just puts inflation in the mind as opposed to
Yeah.
finding a way. I mean, there are basic things that we don't I think about you're out there saying those two concepts go together, and that's how people will think about it.
One thing that we did in the campaign was we made the same mistake we made in 2016, which is we wanted to get credit for the good things we did in the economy. So we just ran around telling everybody the economy is doing really well, which belied their personal experience. So you have a situation where housing costs, like to buy a house, if you were looking at a house in the $300,000 range, that house went to 450 between 2000 and 2024. If you're a young person, if you're 30 years old and you're married and you want to buy a house, that is not a good economy. If you're trying to rent an apartment and you wanted to rent an apartment for $1,000 and now it's $1,800, that is a big freaking deal. And so a lot of what was happening is we looked out of touch and that we weren't listening to what was going on in people's lives. So that was just a strategic mistake. I understand why people made it. But I think that if you look at the messaging coming out of the Progressive Caucus right now, they are not talking about identity issues. They're talking about economic fairness. And I think that, and part of it's going to have to come out to be a younger generation of Democrats, or at least a less institutionalized generation, because Bernie Sanders is not young, but he's less institutionalized.
I would make the argument that at first I pushed back on this. Somebody said, you know what? Boomers definitely need to get out of the way. Even Gen X needs to get out of the way. I was like, oh, we never had a shot. But
I
yes,
know it's not fair.
it's really not fair.
But it's funny, our generation are some of the worst. Gen Xers, like we grew up with the Reagan youth. It's not a question of age, it's a question of institutionalism. There are older people who are fighters, and there are younger people who are towing the corporate line right down the line. So here's the way I kind of see the plan. The plan as I would have it is we start by saying, you may realize that this is what you believed all along, but government matters and it's good for you. And actually, the federal government is worth fighting for, and it matters to our lives, and it's a good thing. And one of the most important things that it does is that it protects us from the overwhelming power of concentrated wealth. That is quite possibly the most important, or one of the most important jobs of the federal government. It's the only thing big enough and strong enough. If we pool all our power together to stand up to people like Meta and these companies that are or the private equity firms that are buying all the single family homes, so you can't afford to buy one, that we need to stand up to these people. And that is what we need the federal government for. And then we say the reason they're dismantling it is because they do not want us to use our government to check the power of concentrated wealth. They are, in fact, dismantling, sabotaging it so they can dismantle it and privatize it. So they can turn over the provision of public goods paid for with public money to private for-profit companies that they can benefit from, but also so that it's not accountable to the public. So that we can't use that federal government to stand up to them when they take advantage of us. And we say that is what Republicans do. That is what Trump does. That is what they're trying to do. They are on the side of concentrated wealth. And then the next step of that is we take this division that they've drawn between Democrats and everybody, so-called liberal elites and everybody else. And we say it's actually, these guys are for that tiny, tiny little group of the super rich. And it's actually the rest of us that are all in this together. So we redraw that division and we say, we're for regular working folks. We're for office workers. We're for small businesses. We're even for big businesses if they're good corporate citizens. We got no problem with Costco. They're behaving themselves. They're contributing to communities. We are not anti-business. We're anti-exploitation.
Mhm.
And so we redraw those divisions and say it's Democrats and everybody else versus Republicans and billionaires.
Right.
And that is how we redraw those dividing lines. And I think that's very different than just saying we're for expanding the safety net. People don't want to hear about the safety net because they're like, I don't want to need the safety net. I just want the system to work. I want to be able
Right.
to work hard. I want to get a job. I want to be able to support my family. I just want it to work as promised. And we have to tell people that's the world that we're going to build. We're going to build a world in which you don't have to worry about government because it just gets its job done and you don't have to think about it. That's what it's there
Right.
for, to run in the background, where you can just do your job. You can have work-life balance. You can own a home. That's what we're fighting for. And that's what these people are taking away from you. And so I think that's what we do. And we make it clear that that's the side that Democrats are on. And there's going to be some Democrats who are not going to be comfortable with that. And there are going to be some who I think it's going to be time for them to call it and retire or just hit the back bench. But that's it. We either take the economic populist position at this point and come out in favor of working people and labor rights and economic fairness, or we fade into oblivion.
Thank you for listening to Freedom Over Fascism. Please leave a rating or review wherever you listen. And if you can, please subscribe at www.freedomoverfascism.us.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.